So I'm really excited to be here with Alex Atherton. Generational differences are a hot topic in all workplaces, especially schools, where obviously generations start from zero right through to maybe some of your really older trustees who are born in different decades. So really interesting to have you here so that we can explore some of your insights. I know you've done a lot of research into this topic, and this is your new book that's out now. Brilliant read, highly recommend it.
Thank you.
So I thought we would just start with a quick introduction from you, if that's all right, Alex, around what motivated you to start investigating this topic.
So the starting point was when I came out of being a head teacher, and I started to notice how the generation of students I'd been responsible for when I was a head, I had 12 years, how they were being described in the media. And then I started to hear the same things being said by my peers, in the various organizations they work in. And then I was also hearing it from my coaching clients. So it started as we can't, a recruitment issue, we can't find them. If we find them, we can't keep them. But if we keep them, we don't understand them. And then, well, what should we focus on today? Well, let's talk about what I'm going to do with my snowflake younger staff. I thought, okay, see the issue here. So there was just this tremendous dissonance between my memory of this group. I'll leave it with you whether we go with Z or Z here. I think that's your editorial responsibility. But those who are now going up to the late 20s, what I remembered them being like and how they were being viewed coming into the workplace. So I just started to dig. And from there, digging into them and doing all the primary research and all those kinds of things, and speaking to lots of different audiences, different industries. The second issue that was coming through was the increasingly multi-generational workplace. Workplaces have always been multi-generational. Schools have always been multi-generational. And we're still at the point where 60 is the retirement age for those in their late 50s or mid to late 50s. But that's going to stop at some point. And in the rest of the workplace, the percentage of those who are 65 or older has doubled in the last 20 years. So the age range in the workplace is growing. And there seems to be quite a consensus that generation, do you want Z or Z?
I say Gen Z.
Right,
That's
okay.
what I've picked up.
Okay, so that Gen Z is different. So there was suddenly all manner of things to start digging into.
It's really interesting, isn't it, that you notice the assumptions that were at play, and because of your lived experience, and let's face it, as educators, we take responsibility, and parents, we take responsibility for the thoughts and attitudes and ethics that and values that are coming up through the generation. Surely we've hopefully had some influence on that. So really interesting that there's then some negative connotations that we need to unpick a little bit. So generalizations are really difficult, aren't they? And I really worry about assumptions and people feeling pigeonholed. So I just want to say with transparency that I know that could be an issue for some people who are looking at this topic. Before we start delving into what the typical sort of differences are between the generations, how do you address that concern?
Yeah, I see my job with this is to build the concept up and take it down again, actually. So I find the concept a useful way of analyzing how change over time has impacted on outlook. And change, social, political, economic, technological, it does have an impact on how people see the world, particularly growing up in your formative years. But it's not a guillotine between them. We're not talking about different species here. It's differences within generations are far bigger than those between, and they are social constructs. So, always recommend people are treated as individuals first and foremost. Of course, but for Gen Z, say, I do think their economic circumstances are particular compared to what came before, immediately before. And I do think the technological revolutions we are experiencing and what they have and what they haven't had experience of, I do think it's relevant. But I'm not into, and when I'm asked to say, well, just, what's this generation like? What's that generation like? It's a very Western concept, apart from anything else. And stereotypes don't help anybody. And no one likes being stereotyped. And Gen Z certainly don't. Probably more than anybody else. But they've inherited the economic situation that they have, and the technology that arrived and coincided with them, the oldest ones, going through their teenage years, was not their doing. It's just what they've experienced.
So positioning it really as a reflection of all the context that's going on in the world and more locally in their society. These are the kind of attributes or characteristics or thought processes that people are likely to have.
More likely to have as well.
More likely to have. And I was just going to ask actually about research into this. What kind of studies have you lent into to evidence your findings?
Yeah, I mean the secondary sources it's hundreds. I mean you've certainly got societal attitudes and so on over time. The big sort of opinion polling companies do, the market research companies do stuff on this. The census, Deloitte does a millennial and Gen Z survey every year, although the years for the different generations are not hard and fast, and I use 97 to 2012, the years of birth of Gen Z. They tend to go just a smaller range of years, which are not irrelevant, but a different kind of approach. So there's a lot of data out there, and in some cases a lot of surveys saying similar things or slightly different things, but there's no shortage of. I mean, it's one ways in which organisations get engagement these days. The big job board websites and the things that they run, and internal research for this and that, and organisations want to do their own stuff and publish it to show that they're thinking about their new employees and so on. So I did get to the point where I could say, well, there's another 300 things to click on here, but I also need to start writing some words and draw the line, actually, because otherwise you never finish.
Yeah. A few things that I was just reflecting on it as I was hearing you say. I know the Gallup survey does one on workplace, I think every year, and the differences of attitude
Yeah, they do.
the people have to workplace.
And globally as well. They don't just go, it's global stuff.
Exactly. And then at the other end of the spectrum, schools often do their own surveys, more often than not, hopefully, and gather feedback from their staff. But I wonder how many of them do it based on generation, whether that might be relevant or helpful for them to do so.
Well, there's an interesting point about it can be quite a helpful exercise, a bit loaded, to say, okay, these are the generations. What do you think of the other ones? Can be quite revealing. But age is also a protected characteristic, and you wouldn't do that with ethnicity and gender. So part of the challenge for this, I think, and particularly the multi-generational workplace in mind, is to articulate the idea that age diversity is a wonderful thing, and organisations don't make the most of it.
Yeah.
And that perspective does matter. Now, you've got all the intersectionality elements, between it, and in many staff rooms across the country, you've got a real mix of people coming from different places and all those kinds of things. So, age as an important feature of diversity, and the extent to which the whole staff body can come together to help solve the big problems rather than relying on the top table to sort it out.
And that's absolutely why we're meeting, and why we're interested from a leadership edge perspective, is to make the workplace of school across the country a more thriving place for everybody. We know that we've got issues with retention, and we know that, well, I think we know that that isn't age specific, it's quite across the board. If you've got any particular data on that would be interesting. But I think for the purpose of this conversation, we're looking at how can we absolutely encourage those types of conversation and that understanding between different generations, so there is a sense of inclusivity and belonging for everybody. So perhaps now we should just tip into what are the key differences across the generations which seem to be causing issues in schools or workplaces in general.
Well, I'd say for Gen Z, they are far less likely to have done work experience at school. That was more common and is coming back now, I think. So I think there's an element of it which is generational, but there certainly was we need them in to do their exams kind of thing. And then health and safety stuff about having 15-year-olds in the workplace and risk assessments and bureaucracy and all that kind of thing. But a survey done a couple of years ago by Speakers for Schools showed it was less than 1 in 4 had done work experience at school, a proper placement, which I couldn't believe, actually. Oh, really? But also, there's a lot of earning that goes on these days, which is not in a physical workplace. If people are buying and selling vintage clothes, or what they call vintage clothes, online, you might be earning, you might have learned how to do all kinds of things, but you've not been doing it in a physical workplace where people 10, 20, 30, 40 years older than you, and that a school is a particular kind of workplace, I think. There's a certain intensity to it. It's all packed into the 6, 7 hours, during the day. There's the pace. Often you're not working with other adults. Predominantly you're working with your client base, call them that, with the students. So they haven't had the same reference points of work. And even, for those, the roots of, what was the school direct or teach first routes, that also cuts out what the PGCE experience gives you. I'm not saying one route's better than another, but a PGCE is by its nature longer. You're having to navigate staff room politics, all those kinds of things. And it's a far higher chance these days that a graduate turns up for the first day in the first proper job, and that is the first experience they've got of a workplace like that.
And I remember, Alex, when I was on my first teaching practice, and the first day I got out of my car, walked through the door of the school, and a student came up and went, "Miss, Miss," and I was like, I'm not Miss, I'm not Miss. But as soon as you're in school, you're on, aren't
Yeah,
you?
you are. Yeah, you are.
Mentally,
Yeah, you are.
physically,
You are.
emotionally available
Yeah.
to anybody who needs you.
Yeah.
And that potentially, if you're coming from a place of working from home or being sheltered and not physically available to people, and you can pick and choose a bit how you communicate, that could be a bit of a shock and a steep learning curve.
Yeah, and those look, for Gen Z, their academic record is off the scale compared to the core, right? Off the scale in terms of degrees. The A levels and GCSEs can be harder to measure. GCSEs changed; they started G9 to 1. But if you just look at how grade boundaries have shifted, all those kind, every time things go up, the outcomes go with it. Now we can look at how effective schools have been and the resources and the culture around that, all that kind of stuff. But I do think we've ended up with an imbalance between the qualifications and the soft skills.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if you were in the room for this bit, but you and I were both at the same event
Yeah.
where a speaker referred to the National Parents Survey,
Mm-hmm.
and with some alarm about parents were a lot less interested in their kids being taught to pass exams than preparation for work.
Yeah. I think it was something like 20% of
Uh,
parents thought that that was the purpose of school. Mm.
yeah, and it was. I think the work stuff was at least twice that, something like
Mm.
that. And particularly for secondary. So, I mean, there's just we could debate that, all day. But the that's a big survey, and if we assume that we can extrapolate that out, what I find talking to young pros, some of whom are ex-students, they resent not being as ready for work as they could have been. But I also think there's something in, I'm not criticizing it at all, but the culture around, right, here's your mock exam, you've done your mock exam, here's your personalized learning checklist, here's all the links to the whatever it is to learn how to do this, here's the past paper, here's the Saturday session, the Wednesday session, all those kinds of things. I'm not criticizing, but saying there's been an impact on a big issue for schools, as was ever thus actually, but still now that everyone's got an experience of school because they've been to one, which isn't true if you go into engineering or farming or whatever it is. But life from the other side is very different, and teaching requires hundreds, ideally, of micro decisions a day. The whole process of the craft of the classroom, there's lifetime skills in that.
Yeah.
And there's an enormous amount of think on your feet. And that's a big adjustment from having incredible quality of resources to work through to make sure you get your 7s, 8s, and 9s, your A stars, and your first class degree. I'm not saying you don't have great resources and CPD and so on. But when you're there live with a class, 50, 60, 75 minutes, that's the heart of the job. And that's a big jump from what might have helped them become successful before. And I remember going back in the last millennium, whenever it was, doing my NQT year, that and my first year of headship were my hardest 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
And that was then. Now, I think the shift from undergraduate life into initial years in teaching, that is one hell of a gear change.
Because what I'm hearing there is that the quality teaching that they have received up until that point, which has been resource rich and instruction rich, could potentially have generated a slight learned helplessness tendency, or certainly a reliance on that level of support, which, as you've alluded to, when you're on your own in front of 30, 32 kids, isn't available to you, and that can be a real shock.
Yeah, I think what I would say, or what I say to employers of any type, any industry, is the need to separate. There's often a need to separate out the onboarding and induction processes. And sometimes they get conflated. Onboarding, what we're trying to do, what we should be doing for the employee. Induction, by the end of that, the employee has got to demonstrate that they can work at the standards we require. And on average, I think the onboarding process has to assume a lower level of reference points for the workplace and all those kinds of things. But if you put decent resources in place and the expectation of where you've got to be, you will see them take off.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But
With the scaffolding.
But you've got to, exactly. It's got to have the scaffolding, and you've got to be clear that you're going to be taking it away, because the classroom is the classroom, and this is how it is.
Okay, so that onboarding is not as simple as a half-day introduction to the school.
July, welcome. Oh, do you not have a tour? Let's have a tour.
Yeah,
How can I
there's
help?
the
You'll work
toilets.
it out.
Yeah, there's
welcome
the staff
to the
room.
family. It'll be fine. You've logged on. Brilliant. That's better than I did on the first day. Yeah.
So what can established leaders who, let's remember, have had a potentially different type of experience up until this point, and what can they do differently to try and connect and support with these Gen Z colleagues coming through?
Well, one expectation I'm noticing going up from young pros is that their managers should be qualified for the post. Or at least a sense of, well, just because you did the job before for 3 years, what training have you had to be a manager?
This reminds me of teaching this generation, where one of them even said to me, yeah, but miss, it doesn't really matter what I'm doing. You should just be grateful for me, because without me, you wouldn't really have a job, would you? And I'm not saying that's what you're alluding to there, but it's a sense of, we know what we expect, and actually this is a partnership, so we need to respect each other. And so that's what I think I was hearing there, if I've got that right, is that the Gen Z want to look to their leaders for real credibility.
They do, but they also understand that it's a complex task being a manager. There'll be criteria for being a good one. There might be some metrics involved in there. They expect to see some rigor. And, because that's how they approach things.
Yeah.
And again, more likely rather than they all are. But in terms of the hunger for just burning the way through one online course after another, picking up this or that skill, all those kinds of things, the idea of becoming a manager by stealth or getting a job by process of elimination, say, it is not, well, that's not quite professional enough.
Okay, so very keen on a meritocracy.
Well, keen on roles being taken seriously, and just I suppose a higher expectation of delivery, really. So I mean, there was someone I was speaking to recently from Teaching School Hub, still fighting for mentors to do mentor training before they become one. Now, I understand, when the early career framework first came out, thinking, right, so they've got to meet them every week. I understand the rationale for that, but where's the thought for the sort of mentor workload with it? Oh, they've got to go to training. Well, they've been an NQT, as was mentor for years, and now they need training. I get that, but I think expectations of those above them are higher, and part of it, I think, is because there's hundreds of thousands of Gen Z already running their own businesses outside school. The junior member of staff in school is the CEO outside. They run a business, they price things, they sell it, they submit accounts, they manage stock. They have top responsibility for what might be, relatively small side hustle, but one that's pretty important in terms of meeting the cost of living or having any kind of social life or whatever it is. So I think there's a different expectation there, and also expectation for them that if they want to go into middle leadership, and plenty don't, but that is the approach that they would take. Because if they didn't have that, they didn't feel that they would have credibility with the ones that they would be looking after.
So the structure and systems and
Yes,
steps, again, the scaffolding almost need to be in place to give that
yes,
clarity and that reassurance that
yeah,
you're following the process and giving
yeah,
it due
yeah,
attention
yeah,
and doing
yeah.
it
And I have
properly.
this quite a lot actually, that I might be asked to come in and speak to or train the middle management group, all of whom ended up in their jobs because they'd been there for a certain amount of time. And I'm not saying they couldn't do it or weren't good at it, but they were really quite flustered, if I put it that way, at the expectations of the junior colleagues of them,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and didn't understand their perspective. Um, and I think there is still an ongoing reluctance for many of my peers to want to see the world through a younger generation's eyes. And I know that, and there's a thing I was at last week and spoke a couple of occasions, and it all starts with the employer thinking about their young staff and who's a pain and that one with and so on, and then all the conversation afterwards is about them as parents who've got sons and daughters in their early 20s. It becomes like year 21 parents evening, or whatever it is, that they haven't necessarily connected the young professionals who may not be having a good time with their organization with the 24-year-old who's still at home experiencing the same, working for somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be quite, those conversations can be quite powerful, actually.
Mm. So if we can understand their expectations
Mm-hmm.
and their needs and respond to them in structured ways, I would like to talk more about those soft skills that you mentioned earlier as well, because that does seem to be a bit of a gap. I was at a conference yesterday and that was alluded to often, about actually giving some skills training
Mm-hmm.
to these younger Gen Z
Mm-hmm.
um, members of our workforce. What have you found to be effective in that regard?
Well, start from the perspective that in this day and age, there's a video taking you through steps 1 to 10 for anything,
Mm. Yeah.
and many of it. You don't have to start from scratch with anything, as long as whatever the task is, you can have a laptop or a phone in front of you and you found a video that you can follow.
Mm.
Obviously, not quite how the lesson. Can you just stop? Year 8, can you just freeze and shut up 5 minutes while I go back to YouTube? So the issues about getting it wrong, inverted commas, um, are quite real, because you're not just having to find the first step, but also the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth. And there's a certain element of developing that independence and confidence in your decision making,
Yeah.
that you go with it. And then afterwards, you might go back and review and chat about it, and why you taught this in this order, this technique, this thing, whatever, whatever it might be. But there's there is something, I think, for organizations just breaking down these skills.
Yeah.
And well, one of the last things I did education wise was be a ECF facilitator. And I do remember thinking at that point that this program is going to have to move on a bit, because it's not meeting the need. And I think we can, well, a typical thing when you do teacher training is you realize how much you've got to break things down for the audience now in front of you. You walk out of your third year or your master's degree and suddenly you're teaching year 8. Well, it's a lot lower level than how how you do all that stuff, how you break it down, lesson plan, scheme of work, whatever. I would say that schools also need to break down a bit more what it is you're actually, the job of teaching. Well, we all know and love, or certainly I did, the one-page teacher standards. and you can get into analysis by price of just breaking this down too much, but it does need breaking, just behavior in the classroom and assessment stuff. Just that extra layer of detail can make all the difference. And I think as an employer, if you find yourself thinking, well, I don't have to tell them this, do I? Do I? I'd say in this day and age, you probably do. Your attempt to be clear will be appreciated, and those who don't need to start on page one won't, because they're very used to guiding themselves through whatever online training thing and so on that it might be. But in the days of you got your mock exam back, you got a D, and that was it.
Must
Now,
try harder.
yeah. But see me. Oh, you said I had to see you, did you? I forgot that. Thanks very much for your, for your assessment. Now, I'm not wishing those days back.
Yeah.
Because I started my teaching career where I think there were league tables, but generally not everyone was paying much attention to them, and I'm not sure every school added up the results either. All right, people just came back in September and what did they get? Oh, okay, what's this year going to be about? And that's not, that's not great. But just to break it down a bit more, and then it's that extra bit of scaffolding.
Yeah.
You end up thinking, am I going to have to hold their hand through all of this? But if you don't to start with, and then say, well, look, next time that bit's coming away. 2 weeks later, that bit and that bit's coming away. You've got to be able to do it.
And it's all starting to come full circle, everything that we've said in this conversation about they've had a lot of support up until this point. So if we can continue to offer that scaffolding, it's actually going to play into their strengths of being thorough and wanting to do a good job and be an authentic and good leader for those people who are coming through. Yeah. Because if they don't feel that, they won't feel great about being in work, will they?
Right. So the ECT that has still got that nightmare class or whatever that keeps them awake at night in late January may not be hanging around. And sink or swim doesn't cut it as a you get to the point where look, you've got to be able to do this, otherwise you can't progress. That's a perfectly reasonable conversation, and if you're a professional, whatever it is, you've got to get used to the scaffolding is coming away. You've got to get used to that idea. But that's not an excuse for not scaffolding in the first place.
Yeah. And I was speaking with an ECT a couple of weeks ago who had done our coaching experience. And she was saying exactly that the reflective time that gave her has basically sustained her during this period, and that if she didn't have that experience, she wouldn't have been thinking that she had the resourcefulness inside her, because she would have been looking outward, and she'd been saying, why aren't people helping me? Why aren't the answers coming to me? But what the coaching and reflective space did was made her look inward and go, well, I suppose I could try this, and really think about it.
That's right.
Great. So if we're looking then at all those things that we could do as an employer and as a leader to support the people coming through, can we flip that narrative a bit and say, well, what could Gen Z do to articulate what they need from their employer or from their leader?
Yeah, I think in today's done for you society, and that applies to all of us, I think there is a sense that whatever we use, whatever service we use, whatever app we're on, that it will be really intuitive. And when it isn't, we can struggle a bit with it. So, for example, random example, conversation I was in recently about music streaming platforms. And I remember saying, oh, this is terrible because this is this. And I'm thinking, honestly, the technology of just having this compared to what I grew up with is incredible. And we overlook that a bit. Generally, what I hear from employers and managers is their young staff are not backwards in coming forward and saying what they need.
Okay.
But there is definitely also a lot of people being reluctant to ask, to use channels that might be available, and can worry a bit too much about standing out, not wanting to be seen as high maintenance, and all those kinds of things. And sometimes schools and other organisations are good at having those channels, and sometimes they're not.
Yeah, and this might come down to relationships and
Yeah,
culture
yeah,
and psychological safety.
yeah, right. So if you've got an ECT that's got a full set of grade 7 plus at GCSE, 2 A stars and an A level, and a first class degree, and then finds themselves going into teaching because they're socially minded, and by the end of September they feel like they're being hit by a bus, they may not have failed, inverted commas, or feel like they were coming close to that at any point. And it can be quite paralyzing, that. So I'd encourage any young professional to actually say where you're at. Don't be, it's like any difficult conversation, don't be afraid to describe the impact of it either. Because if you don't describe where you are, and if your mentor or professional lead hasn't worked it out, they can't meet you where you are either. And the truth is, in many jobs and professions, they're going in, young pros are going in and bouncing out.
Yeah.
Because it's a lot harder and or different, disappointing, maybe. I mean, the job market is so dire at the moment. I think everyone's just trying to hang on to whatever they've got. But in teaching, keep the figures of how many leave within the first year. And generally people will see out the year, not always, but in lots of other industries, that's just not where it's at. You've got to be prepared to say what you need and how difficult you think it is. Otherwise, people can't help you.
I love that, and just encouraging that honesty sometimes takes, as the ECT I was referring to, dedicating some time to really think that through for yourself, because
Yeah,
we're unlikely to articulate something that we're
yeah,
unsure about. We're more likely to articulate it when we're convinced that that is true for us. So
yeah.
actually taking that time to sit with how you're feeling and reflect on that, find the words for it, and then you're sort of rehearsing it and prepared to say what it is you want to say, rather than being caught off guard in a difficult moment and it kind of exploding out of you. That's not comfortable for people often.
No, but I think often young, I think this is a shift because of the level of and quality of guidance there is for how you turn your grade 7 into a 9 and you aim to your A star. Their expectations of themselves as a young professional can be phenomenal.
Mm-hmm.
Phenomenal. And if you end up, I know it's an unhelpful thing to do to quantify it. If you end up after your first year of teaching, if you're a solid 6 or 7 out of 10 teacher, you've done incredibly well. And there'll be a lot of decisions you've made that you wouldn't make again, a huge learning experience and so on. But when you've been trained throughout your school career where you can get to 100%, this is how, and then into professional life, it is different.
Yeah.
It is different, and there may be a need to be kinder to yourself, actually, than they might feel is reasonable.
And that again is an interesting flip around, isn't it? Because if they potentially are coming to this with an expectation that they're going to be hitting, the highest expectations possible as quickly as possible, and if they're not, then there's a failing in that. To almost flip that round and say, well, I'm doing okay unless people tell
Yeah,
me I'm not, which
yeah,
is a bit vacuous.
yeah,
And I was at this conference yesterday where someone was espousing the virtues of using we. when you onboard people into your team, you know, we are here for you. You are part of a team.
Yeah,
You are
yeah,
part of a
yeah,
professional development community. You're not on your own here. And that seems to be coming through from what you're saying as well.
yeah, yeah. It's takes a village to raise a child.
Mm,
You know, I think there is a bit of that, and it's this is a really difficult job
yeah.
and a really difficult job to do well.
Mm.
You know, so yeah, be kind to yourself, folks.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great message, isn't it? So, what lessons do we need to learn? Obviously, we've learned a lot here about Gen Z, but just in terms of how do we, as a profession and a society, perhaps continue to pay attention to the different generations that obviously will continue to be coming through? Are there any structures or methods or
Uh,
attitudes that we need to try and harness to make sure that we mitigate against these kind of frictions moving forwards?
yeah, I think partly these are universal themes. You know, it's always made good copy for whoever reads whatever newspaper to be told that young people aren't what they used to be, and all those kinds of things.
Mm.
And I also think these challenges have become amplified with social media because I mean you can have four people, you know, the 25-year-old, 35, 45, 65, whatever, in the same staff room at lunchtime, all on the same app, but having entirely different experiences. I think we've got less sense actually of the universal experience now that used to be the case. And you can see when something does happen, obviously not everyone watched Celebrity Traitors, but you actually have some there that cuts across,
Yes. Yeah.
whereas we've ended up all being very niche. So I would say it is the collective responsibility of any workforce to know each other and to take the time to understand each other's perspectives. Opinions, you know, coming from different age, different ethnic background, you know, whatever it is, there is enormous richness in staff rooms. And by having those conversations, there is so much, there's so much to gain. And as retirement ages climb in teaching and as they are everywhere else, the age range in the staff room is only going to grow. And it only makes that kind of dialogue more important.
Absolutely. So remaining objective and open-minded, and I think curious above all about seeing things from each other's perspectives and trying to avoid that assumption led approach that we can have, and that
Yeah,
collusion that can
yeah,
sometimes happen when you find a like-minded person who thinks the
yeah, yeah.
same thing about the other types of people, and it can become
Yeah.
divisive like that.
But it can, but the like-minded person might be the 65-year-old and the 25-year-old who've never had the conversation.
Mm.
You know, the person who's best with tech, inverted commas, in the organization might be the oldest person in it. You know, but I think there's also accepting that your own bias or that you have more of a perspective than maybe you thought you had. What might be normal to you may not be normal to others, and there's lots of ways. um, you know, there's a million ways of delivering a great lesson. You know,
Love
let's
that.
explore them.
Yeah, and that self-awareness again, taking time to reflect on what's really going on for you, so then you can address it. Well,
Yeah,
that's been really interesting talking to you, really insightful. And if
thank
people
you.
are interested in finding out more about what you do and how you can support them with exploring and being curious about these issues and bringing different perspectives to the fore, how could they find out more about what you offer?
Uh, LinkedIn is a good place. Alex Atherton on LinkedIn, or you can go straight to alexatherton.com.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time today, Alex. It's been a real pleasure to hear your insights. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, Catherine.
Absolute pleasure. Bye for now.